St. Jude's Infirmary, October 1988. The rain didn't just fall that afternoon. It attacked the infirmary window. It was a relentless drumming rhythm against the thin glass, seeming to keep time with the rattling, shallow breath of the man lying in the bed. The room smelled of ammonia, boiled vegetables, and that unmistakable metallic scent of a life winding down. I've sat by many bedsides in my decades as a chaplain. You'd think the sheer volume of final breaths would build a callus over a man's soul, a sort of professional detachment. It doesn't. Not for me. Every time I walk into one of these sterile rooms, the weight of it sits heavy on my chest. I still feel the profound intrusion of being a stranger invited into the most intimate moment of a human existence. The exit. The nurse had told me his name was Elias, 89 years old. No next of kin listed in his file. Just a ward of the state, dying alone in a room painted a color that couldn't decide if it was green or beige. When I first saw him, he looked less like a man and more like something carved from ancient dried wood and left out in the elements too long. His skin was deep brown, leathery, and mapped with 1,000 creases that spoke of decades under a harsh sun and salt spray. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but they were milky white, clouded entirely by thick cataracts. He was blind to the room, but as I would soon learn, he was seeing something else entirely, something from 44 years ago. I pulled a metal chair close to the bed. The legs scraped loudly against the linoleum floor, a harsh screech that made me wince. But Elias didn't flinch. He just lay there, his large hands, with knuckles thickened by arthritis, gripping the thin hospital sheet like it was a lifeline in a gale. Elias, I said his name softly, trying to slip my voice under the noise of the rain. My name is Thomas. I'm the chaplain here. The nurses thought you might like some company. Silence. Just the wet rattle in his chest. I waited. In this line of work, silence is your primary tool. You have to get comfortable with it. Let it stretch until the other person feels the need to fill it. I watched the rise and fall of his chest under the thin blanket. Finally, his lips moved. They were dry, cracked. A sound came out, like two stones grinding together underwater. "The light," he rasped. His voice was surprisingly deep, echoing a past strength. "Is the light on?" I glanced up at the fluorescent bulb flickering miserably on the ceiling. "Yes, Elias, the light is on in the room." He shook his head, a slow, painful tremor. "Not that light, you fool. The big light, the glass." He was talking about the lighthouse. I had read his sparse file. For 40 years, Elias had been the keeper at Blackwood Point, one of the most isolated stations on the jagged northern coast, a place where the ocean didn't just touch the land, it constantly tried to chew it away. "I don't know about the lighthouse, Elias," I said gently, leaning closer. "You're in the hospital now. You're safe." He let out a cough that sounded like tearing canvas. When he caught his breath, those milky, blind eyes turned unerringly toward the sound of my voice. "Safe," he spat the word out like a curse. "Nobody is safe, not near Blackwood. I kept it lit, every night. Wick trimmed, oil brass polished until I could see my own ugly face in it. 40 years, I was a good watchman. He was agitated now. His grip on the sheets tightened until his knuckles turned wax white. "I'm sure you were," I soothed, placing my hand lightly on his forearm. His skin felt like cold parchment. "No," he whispered, the energy draining out of him suddenly. "No, I wasn't. Not that night, the winter of 44. I froze. The winter of 1944. Anyone who grew up on this coast knows what happened in the winter of '44 off Blackwood Point. The troop transport ship, the SS Caroline, carrying over 200 souls back from the European theater, vanished in a blizzard. It was the worst maritime disaster in our state's history. The official report called it an act of God, a tragic convergence of zero visibility and monstrous swells. The lighthouse was mentioned only in passing. It was assumed the snow obscured the beam. Elias was breathing harder now. The confession was bubbling up, something toxic he had held down for nearly half a century. This is the part of my work that haunts me the most. We all carry secrets, little locked boxes in the cellar of our hearts. I have mine, you have yours. We think if we keep them locked tight enough, they'll die of starvation. But they don't die, they rot, and the rot spreads. If you're carrying something like that right now, something that feels heavy when the room gets quiet, I want you to know you aren't alone in that feeling. We are all keepers of our own dark towers. Elias, I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was beginning to hammer. What happened in the winter of '44? He pulled his hand away from mine and pressed his palms against his temples, as if trying to crush the memory inside his own skull. The storm, it was a living thing that night, he murmured, his voice drifting back in time. Wind screaming so loud you couldn't think. The waves were hitting the tower halfway up, shaking the whole foundation. But I was up in the lantern room. I had the rotation going, the Fresnel lens. Beautiful glass. It was cutting through the snow. It was working. He stopped. The silence in the room became suffocating. The rain outside seemed to fade away. And then, I prompted. Elias turned his blind face toward the window, toward the rain he couldn't see but could surely hear. And then I heard the engine, not the ship's engine, a car engine, down on the service road on the mainland cliff. Nobody came out there in a storm like that. Nobody. His breath hitched. I went down the spiral stairs, 400 steps. I looked out the heavy door. There was a man standing there in the sleet. He yelled something up to me. The wind tore his words away, but I knew him. I knew who he was, and I knew who was on that ship heading toward us. He grabbed my wrist this time. His grip was shockingly strong, desperate. It wasn't the snow, Chaplain. The light didn't fail. He pulled me closer, his dead eyes inches from mine, his breath smelling of decay. I doused it. I stopped the rotation, and I doused the wick. I plunged Blackwood Point into darkness 5 minutes before the Caroline hit the reef. I stared at him, horrified. The weight of his admission sucked the air out of the room. 200 men. Why, Elias? I whispered. He slumped back against the pillows, exhausted by the truth. Because some things, he whispered, are worse than death, and some people don't deserve to come home. I sat back, reeling. The rain battered the glass again, louder this time. I looked at this wreckage of a man, this keeper of the light who had chosen darkness. We often think of sin as an action, a violent deed, a stolen object, but how often do we consider the devastation of inaction, of the hand not offered, the truth not spoken, or the light willfully extinguished? Sometimes the loudest scream is the one we never make. The room felt smaller after that. The air, already thick with the scent of antiseptic and impending death, seemed to vibrate with the weight of 200 ghosts. I pulled my hand back from Elias's arm, my skin crawling as if I had touched something electrified. I looked at the man in the bed, this frail, broken shell, and tried to reconcile him with the image of a man standing in a high tower, watching a ship full of boys drift toward their graves while he held the lantern's wick in his fingers like a candle he was about to blow out. My heart was doing a frantic dance against my ribs. As a chaplain, I am trained to be a vessel for the truth, no matter how heavy it is. But this was a mountain. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt for even being the one to hear it. I wondered if some secrets are meant to be buried with the men who kept them. I wondered if I was strong enough to carry this for him. "Elias," I said, my voice cracking like dry wood. 200 men. There were boys on that ship, sons, fathers, people who had survived the horrors of Europe only to be murdered a mile from home. Why? Who was so important that their lives were worth the cost of an entire crew? Elias didn't answer immediately. He turned his head back toward the ceiling, his milky eyes tracking something only he could see. The rain outside shifted, a sudden gust of wind slamming it against the window with a sound like a handful of gravel. "The man at the door," Elias whispered, his voice gaining a strange rhythmic quality, like he was reciting a liturgy. His name was Silas. He was a local from the village, a fisherman whose hands were as scarred as mine. He was soaking wet, shivering so hard I could hear his teeth clicking together over the roar of the gale. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a man who had already died and forgotten to lie down. He paused, a long whistling breath escaping his lungs. I let him in. I shouldn't have. The rules of the light are absolute. No visitors in the lantern room, especially not during a storm. But Silas, he had a look in his eyes that made me think he'd throw himself off the cliff if I shut the door. We climbed those 400 stairs in silence. Every step felt like we were leaving the world of the living behind. When we got to the top, under the great revolving lens, he pointed out at the black void of the ocean. I could almost see it. The way he described it, I could feel the vibration of the lighthouse tower in my own feet. I could smell the hot oil of the lamp and the ozone of the storm outside. He told me, Elias continued, that a man was on the SS Caroline, a man named Major Julian Vance. To the papers, Vance was a war hero, a decorated officer coming home to a parade and a political career. But Silas knew the truth. I knew the truth. Before the war, Vance was the son of the wealthiest family in the county. He was a man who thought the world was his playground and the people in it were just toys to be broken. Elias's hand found mine again, gripping it with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. 10 years before that night, Vance had taken Silas's younger sister into the woods behind the estate. She was 16. When they found her 2 days later in the creek, the Vances used their money to silence the sheriff. They called it an accident, a tragic slip. Silas spent 10 years watching that family thrive while his mother grieved herself into an early grave. And now, Vance was coming back. He was coming back as a hero, untouchable, ready to lead the very people he had stepped on. He stopped, his chest heaving. The monitor beside the bed began to beep faster, a sharp, rhythmic intrusion into the story. A nurse poked her head in, looking concerned, but I waved her off. I couldn't stop now. I was drowning in his words. Silas looked at me, Elias said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper, and he said, "Elias, if that light stays on, the monster walks free. If it goes dark, the monster stays in the sea. God won't judge him, so we have to." I looked at the lens. I looked at the beam of light cutting through the snow like a sword. I thought about my own life, 20 years in that tower, alone, forgotten. I thought about the justice that never came for Silas, and I realized I had the power to be the judge. I had the power to stop the parade. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This is the moment we all fear, isn't it? The moment where we are given the chance to fix a wrong by committing another one. We tell ourselves it's for the greater good. We tell ourselves that the scales need to be balanced. But who gave us the right to hold the weights? Take a moment to look at your own life. Have you ever held a secret because you thought the truth would do more damage? Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken, or spoken when you should have listened? We all want to believe we'd be the hero of the story, but sometimes we're just the hand that turns off the light. I didn't just turn it off, Elias said, tears finally leaking from those blind, clouded eyes. I watched. I stood on the gallery walkway in the freezing sleet. I watched the black shape of the ship emerge from the white curtain of the storm. I heard the whistle, a long, desperate blast. They were looking for me. They were screaming for the light. And I just stood there, Silas right beside me, both of us carved from stone. When the ship hit the reef, the sound wasn't like a crash. It was a groan, a long, slow tearing of metal and wood that sounded like the earth itself was crying out. He began to sob then, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to come from his stomach. The screams, Chaplain. The wind carries them better than you'd think. 200 men. I killed them all to make sure one man didn't get a parade. I thought I was doing something righteous. But as the sun came up the next morning and I saw the debris floating in the cove, the life jackets, the letters from home, the bodies, I realized Silas was gone. He had vanished into the night, and I was the only one left in the tower, the only one who knew that the light didn't fail. I did. I sat there, the silence of the room now heavy with the weight of 200 souls. I looked at Elias, and for the first time, I didn't see a dying man. I saw a man who had been dead for 44 years, just waiting for someone to finally bury him. But here is the question that has kept me awake every night since that October afternoon. If you were standing in that tower, holding the fate of a monster in your hands, but knowing that 100 innocents were tied to his waist, would you have the courage to let the monster live, or the arrogance to let everyone die? St. Jude's Infirmary, 3 o'clock in the morning. The storm had finally begun to exhaust itself. The aggressive drumming against the glass had slowed to a rhythmic, mournful tap like a tired hand knocking on a door it knows will never open. Inside the room, the air felt stagnant, heavy with the electricity of a storm that had moved from the sky into the soul of the man in the bed. Elias was fading. I could see it in the way his jaw had gone slack, the way his breath was no longer a rattle but a thin, whistling sigh. His grip on my wrist had loosened, but his fingers still twitched against my skin, as if he were trying to Morse code one final message into the marrow of my bones. I sat there in the dim light of the single flickering bulb, my own mind a tempest. My heart felt like it had been hollowed out with a rusted spoon. You see, when Elias had started his story, I was just a chaplain doing a job. I was a professional listener, a repository for the sins of the dying. But when he mentioned the SS Caroline, when he mentioned the date and the reef, the world shifted on its axis. I reached into the inner pocket of my tweed jacket. My fingers brushed against a small, cold object I had carried for nearly half a century. A small silver locket, dented and salt-scoured. Inside was a photograph of a young man, barely 19, with a lopsided grin and eyes full of a future that never arrived. His name was David. He was my older brother, and he had been a private in the infantry, returning home on the SS Caroline after 3 years of hell in the trenches of France. For 44 years, I had told myself David was taken by a storm. I had told myself that God, in his infinite and often terrifying wisdom, had decided David's work on earth was done. I had found peace in the idea of a natural disaster. But now, sitting in this room that smelled of death and damp wool, I was looking at the man who had actually turned out the light. I was looking at the hand that had guided my brother into the rocks. The anger was sudden and white-hot. It flared up in my chest, a burning desire to stand up, to rip the oxygen mask from this old man's face, and to scream the name of my brother into his deaf ears. I wanted him to know. I wanted him to feel the weight of the one specific life he had stolen from me. But then I looked at Elias's face. He wasn't a monster. He was a wreck. He was a man who had spent 44 years in a prison of his own making, a tower of silence more isolating than any lighthouse. He had lived every day with the sound of those 200 screams echoing in his head. He had gone blind, perhaps because his own mind couldn't bear to look at the world anymore. I realized then that justice is a cold, hard thing, but mercy is a fire that burns the one who gives it as much as the one who receives it. Elias, I whispered, leaning so close I could feel the faint warmth of his last few breaths. His milky eyes drifted toward me, though I knew he saw nothing but the dark. I have a secret too, I said. My voice was thick, shaking like a leaf in the wind. My brother was on that ship. David, he was 19. He loved the sea. He used to say the lighthouses were the stars come down to earth to guide the lost. A tremor went through Elias's body. A small, choked sound escaped his throat, a sob that had been trapped for decades. "I'm sorry," he wheezed. "I'm so sorry." I looked at the silver locket in my hand. Then I reached out and placed it into Elias's open palm. I closed his cold, leathery fingers around it. "Elias," I said, and the words felt like they were being dragged over broken glass. "I am a priest of the church, but right now I am just a brother, and in the name of David and the 200 men who never saw the shore, I forgive you. The light is back on, Elias. You can go home now." The monitor gave a long, steady beep. The line went flat. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there in the quiet of the hospital room as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the clouds. The rain had stopped. The world was terrifyingly still. I watched the nurses come in, watched them pull the sheet over that leathery, peaceful face. They didn't know they were covering a murderer. They didn't know they were covering a victim. As I walked out of the infirmary and into the cool morning air, I realized that we are all keepers of some broken light. We all have moments where we chose the shadow over the flame. But we cannot let the shipwrecks of our past define the entire ocean of our future. If you've been carrying a secret that is drowning you, if you've been holding on to a darkness that you think can never be lit, I want you to look at the horizon. There is always a second chance. There is always a way to turn the light back on. Would you like me to help you open a new page of your own diary and find the words you've been too afraid to say? Because the ultimate truth of the human heart is this: sometimes the only way to save yourself from drowning is to stop trying to hold on to the wreckage. Are you ready to let go of yours?